So having set the scene by comparing ourselves to other animals, we're now going to take a more standard view of human development from the point of view of the developmental psychologist. There's a wide variety of approaches to understanding human development, of course, and we're going to identify two landmark figures, each of whom is extremely important in our current understanding of human development, and they form an interesting contrast. Excuse me. They draw out different contrasts. These are the two guys we're going to talk about, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, and they were born in the same year, in 1896. But Vygotsky died very young in 1934, whereas Piaget lived to a high old age, only died in 1980. They were born in different places. Jean Piaget is a French man. Vygotsky was born in what was Russia and became the Soviet Union, so he lived through the Russian Revolution. Revolutions change things. After a revolution, old barriers between disciplines, old walls come crumbling down, and in the middle of chaos, there is sometimes room for enormous creativity. This was the case after the formation of the Soviet Union. There was an enormous amount of extremely creative, wonderful scientific work done in the Soviet Union. It didn't last very long because of the repressive policies of the state, but for a period of, 10, 15 years, there was some wonderful work by a lot of scholars who, because it was the Soviet Union, didn't come to the attention of the West for a long time. So Piaget, being French, was known in Western circles the whole time, of course. Vygotsky's work was far less well known here in the West until I think the 1970s. Nowadays, you wouldn't be considered knowledgeable about development unless you knew these two figures and a lot more. But it took much longer for Vygotsky's work to impinge on the Western scientific field. Given their different backgrounds, these guys take rather different approaches to considering what a person is. Piaget is from France, and he comes from a strongly individualist culture. He was part and parcel of the cognitive turn that we've identified after the Second World War. So those were the kind of terms he talked about. And importantly, he focused on the child as if it was a developing biological organism. Now, when you watch biological development, what you see is that things happen in a particular sequence, and they must happen in that particular sequence. So if you have a sunflower seed, and you want to get more sunflower seeds, you plant it, water it, and first of all, two little leaves sprout up, and then a stalk comes up, and then more leaves occur, and then the stalk grows up, and then eventually a flower comes out, and then the flower is pollinated, and now you got new seeds. That was a sequence of steps, and you can't skip one. You can't rearrange those steps. You can't get to a later step until you've gone through the earlier steps. Piaget wanted to take this kind of way of looking at development and apply it to the person. So he was interested in maturation and change within an individual. Not surprising, perhaps, but Vygotsky will give us an alternative, because Vygotsky comes from, yes, a communist country, where the role of the individual was in many respects subordinate to their role within society, where the degree to which something belonged or was attributed to an individual was downplayed compared to France, but the importance of the social bonds and mutuality was much stronger there. So this accounts to some degree for the very different perspectives taken by them. So for the rest of this video, we'll just look at Jean Piaget, and in the next video, we'll turn to Vygotsky. They contrast strongly. Incidentally, because they take different viewpoints with respect to the infant, that doesn't mean they're in a fight. It doesn't mean that one of them has to be right and one of them has to be wrong. Throughout this module, we'll see that complex topics, language, mind, perception, development, don't admit of simple answers. Rather, we have to learn that there are very different ways of articulating well-formed questions that provide qualitatively different kinds of answers. So these two guys illuminate human development from different standpoints, and they bring out different things about us. They're not two football teams fighting a match. Okay? So Piaget's focus, as I said, was on trying to find out what the sequence was. Now, unlike my sunflower example, the child doesn't grow leaves, doesn't get a flower coming out of its top. So what are the stages that you might identify in a child? Well, Piaget was interested in cognition. For Piaget, that largely meant intellectual activity. We've seen that the cognitive turn after the end of the Second World War brought forth strongly rationalist, abstract intellectual concerns. This is very much how many thinkers were thinking of the person. So he wants to understand changes in the ability to think, changes in the ability to abstract, changes in the ability to solve puzzles. This kind of emergent ability is what Piaget is trying to track. Now, you can learn to play tiddlywinks at any age. There's no God-given age to learn to play tiddlywinks, and there's no particular age at which you learn to fry an egg either. And there's no staging there. You could learn to fry an egg today and learn tiddlywinks next week, or you could learn tiddlywinks today and learn to fry an egg next week. So that's not what Piaget is looking for. He's looking for things that have a necessary sequence. And all the time he's keeping his eye out for a move that seems to happen in children from attending to the world in very concrete terms, aware only of their immediate environment, interacting with the world using their whole body, to more abstract thinking, trying to formalize understanding of the world, to generalize, to develop what we might call intellectual thought. So these are the hallmarks that Piaget is looking out for, and he draws some crude lines here. Like our sunflower, he's trying to find stages in the human development. And he's got 4 stages here, which go from 0 to 15. After that, as far as Piaget is concerned, you're done, you're baked. There's no hard and fast lines between these stages, except for the first one. The sensorimotor stage starts at birth, so that's a well-defined starting point. And it goes on until the child starts to use language. So the sensorimotor stage is alinguistic. At least the child is not producing language. So that's reasonably well defined. The pre-operational stage, Piaget pegs at sort of age 2 to 7. Now, Piaget's work has been extremely influential, and so that corresponds roughly to how we consider the education of children from preschool, kindergarten, junior infants, senior infants, and not much beyond. So it's that early stage of schooling. Piaget's ideas have fed in to our design of education. The third stage is the concrete operational stage, here from age 7 to 11 roughly, and this has been integrated into our education systems, and we see it as the second half of primary school, where you start to learn your tables. Maybe you're learning a foreign language. The kind of tasks that you ask of a child at this age are quite different from those in kindergarten. The final stage that Piaget is concerned with, the formal operational stage from 11 to 15, would correspond again to the first few years in secondary school, and you're all aware of the great shift that happens between primary school and secondary school. In primary school, you stay still and you have one teacher, and the teacher changes subject, but the room stays steady. In secondary school, you walk around from classroom to classroom. You're going to French here, woodwork there, maths there, and the requirements on you are very, very different. So Piaget's idea that there are different things you can appropriately ask of a child at different ages, and that there's no point in trying to get these in any other sequence, has been very influential in the design of our education curricula. And throughout these stages, what Piaget is asking is, how does the child deal with a new challenge? How does the child handle a situation it's never met before? In what way can it adapt to a new situation? And for Piaget, there's basically two kinds of change he would like to distinguish. Both of them are means of adapting to a new situation. So a new situation happens and you're changed after it. Assimilation is the less profound change. When you encounter a new situation and it's novel, but it doesn't rearrange you, it doesn't do your head in, it doesn't fundamentally change who you are, how you think, then we speak of assimilation. So experience is incorporated into existing cognitive structures, adds to your repertoire and your ability. So having learned backgammon and chess, you can now learn tiddlywinks, although he's not talking about games here. But the point is here that the new experience doesn't restructure you and doesn't alter the way that you deal with subsequent experiences greatly. Accommodation is the term that Piaget uses for change that does fundamentally change you. As when you acquire, for example, the ability to count, thereafter that changes the way you're going to solve problems. So that leads to a structural change in your cognitive repertoire. Before you can count, you have one relation to the multiplicity of objects around you. After you've learned to count, you have a means of dealing with multiplicity that you didn't have before. This idea that you encounter the world on the basis of capacities, which Piaget often refers to as cognitive structures, which change as they go along, is one form of what we might call constructivism. That is to say, the ability to deal with a situation in the world resides in capacities that have been constructed within the child on the basis of its past experiences. The term constructivism has other meanings too. This is Piagetian constructivism. So just to briefly run through the stages, at this early stage, the sensorimotor stage, the child is pre-linguistic. So they interact first of all with the mouth largely, and then with their hands. They touch things an awful lot. They only engage with things which are immediately present, not having language or fancy notions. This child is incapable of thinking about things that are not actually present. In fact, and this is one of the real insights to get from Piaget's work, we now know that there is one of these stages that fundamentally changes you is when you grasp the idea of object persistence. If a very young child sees an object in front of it, and now the object is occluded or taken away, it doesn't know it exists. It's not expecting it to come back. This is why peekaboo is such a fun game to play with the children at that age, because you literally disappear and then you reappear. Once you've acquired object persistence, peekaboo loses some of its charm, I suppose. Now, the pre-operational stage, again, remember this is sort of kindergarten, early stage primary school. The child has started to use language, so it now has words and can begin to form sort of concepts in a certain way. So we see this child here playing with a truck which now has a label, and we saw how labels change thinking even for chimpanzees. Of course, to describe what a very young child is doing here as thinking is an act of indulgence on our part. That's fine, but if you've ever played with a child in kindergarten, it's crazy. They're all over the place. To call it fanciful and wishful is being very, very nice. Their thinking is not your thinking. Another thing that's notable is that their understanding of time is very limited. And this is the way why parents end up having to go in the run-up to Christmas. Only 5 more sleeps till Christmas. Only 4 more sleeps till Christmas. You may have done this yourself for a younger brother or sister or a young nephew or niece. And anything you might call reasoning here is restricted to concrete operations in the here and now, maybe putting things on top of each other, poking things, banging things. So now when we move on to the later stages of primary school, we're in the concrete operational stage. Now abstract thinking and reasoning begin to appear. This is where we would ask children to learn their times tables using joint speech. They recite it. So this reasoning is now supported by practical physical aids. The child is learning to write as well, to do elementary sums. to generalize. So here, for example, the child now knows that this is not only the thing it has in its hand, called truck, but it knows that it's one of a class of trucks and that it could be a blue truck or there could be a bigger or better truck somewhere. So new ways of interpreting what's going on are now available to the child. And then with the big leap to secondary school, we all become geniuses. Abstract reasoning about abstract concepts. I'm sure when you went to secondary school, the first thing you did was dive into differential calculus, wasn't it? Logic and reason are superbly developed at this age. I'm exaggerating. Maybe it's not quite like that, but certainly society expects you to be capable of learning things in early secondary school that you would never challenge a primary school kid with. So you can see the sequencing that Piaget is doing, and you can see how it influences the way that we structure the environment of the child and formally design our educational institutions. Piaget has been very influential. And in the next video, we'll look at Lev Vygotsky.